Delivery Malaysian 370, good morning.
Malaysian 370, standby.
It's the 8th of March 2014. A Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 is preparing for a long-haul flight to Beijing, China.
Malaysian 370, request level.
370, we are ready, requesting flight level 350 to Beijing.
They have 5.5 hours of flying ahead of them. The plane soon taxis to the runway, and at 12:40 a.m.,
370, 32 right of takeoff, 9. Press right, Station Malaysia 37,
MH370 accelerates down the runway and departs Kuala Lumpur Airport. The biggest mystery in aviation history has just begun.
Wings.
Malaysian 370, climb flight level 350.
As the plane climbs to 35,000 feet, they are cleared to fly direct to their first waypoint, Iguri, which is here. The plane crosses the Malaysian coastline, and it is now over the vast South China Sea. So far, everything is routine. And at around 1:15 a.m., 45 minutes after takeoff, the plane nears Iguri. The pilots are instructed to contact Vietnam ATC.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
The crew are supposed to check in with Vietnam within 1 minute of handoff. The plane crosses Iguri and begins turning right towards its next waypoint, Bitod. This plane never contacts Vietnam. And around 2 minutes after making this turn, MH370 disappears from radar. A modern commercial airliner carrying 239 people has vanished. Every airplane has a device called a transponder. This device transmits information like the plane's ID, its location, and its speed to air traffic control. ATC uses this information to track the plane. This type of tracking is called secondary radar. If the plane disappears from ATC screens, it can only mean one thing: the transponder has stopped working. Malaysian ATC wasn't monitoring the plane as they had handed it off to Vietnam.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
Vietnam wasn't monitoring the plane as it hadn't checked in with them yet. This plane is in no man's land. For a whole 18 minutes, no one notices that a plane is missing. But then, Vietnam begins to wonder why the plane that they were expecting hasn't checked in yet. So, they call Malaysia, asking them what happened to the plane. It is only at this point that Malaysia is aware that a plane has gone missing. A multinational search effort is launched, concentrating around the last known position of the plane in the South China Sea. Time is critical. The search crew needs to find the plane soon to have any chance of saving the passengers on board. Sadly, there's nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no survivors, nothing. But then, a bombshell revelation. After the plane disappeared from radar, Malaysian military detected and tracked MH370 turning back and flying across Malaysia, headed northwest up the Straits of Malacca, and then disappeared out of range just here north of Sumatra. It's a shocking discovery. After disappearing from radar, this plane did not crash. But the Malaysian military fails to share this information publicly for 5 whole days. At first glance, the U-turn taken by MH370 looked like a plane that had an emergency, and the pilots were turning back to land at a nearby airport. In the cargo of MH370 was a container full of lithium-ion batteries. These batteries, when damaged, can overheat and cause a fire. And this fire could have disrupted the transponder from functioning. But the problem with this theory is that the plane made no attempt to land, and it kept flying until it was out of military radar range. Although there were military installations of other nations nearby, they were not forthcoming in providing data to the search party. India claimed that the military radar at Nicobar Islands was turned off during peace times. Indonesia claimed that their military radar was turned off because they had no fuel for the generators. So the search is redirected to the Indian Ocean, the Straits of Malacca, and the Bay of Bengal. In 2005, shortly after takeoff, ATC lost contact with Helios Flight 522. After flying for 2 hours without communicating with ATC, the plane crashed near Grammatico in Greece, making it the worst accident in Greek history. The investigation into that crash revealed that the plane's pressurization was set to manual, and the plane gradually depressurized as it climbed. And everyone on board died of hypoxia. Did the same thing happen to MH370? Even if the pilots had become incapacitated, the autopilot would have continued to fly the plane in the planned route, first going to Bitod and then flying onwards to Beijing. The autopilot would not have made the U-turn that we see here. A closer look at the flight path over the Malay Peninsula reveals something interesting. The plane is seen making minor course corrections constantly. An autopilot would have just set a particular heading and flown in a straight line, different from what we see here. And that's not all. Investigators found 2 other clues. First, when they overlaid the air traffic from that time with MH370's path, they noticed 2 other planes nearby. An Emirates 343 headed from Kuala Lumpur to Dubai, and another plane coming from Chennai in the opposite direction. MH370 is seen making a sidestep, moving 15 nautical miles to the right to avoid these planes. The second clue came when investigators tried to replicate this turn in the simulator with the autopilot on. But they just couldn't make the turn. Normally, when the autopilot makes a turn, it uses a bank angle of 25 degrees. But in this case, the turn started with the usual 25 degrees, and then the angle was sharply increased to 38 degrees to complete the turn. This is not typical autopilot behavior. Just north of Iguri lies the Thai Air Defense Zone. If an unauthorized plane enters this area, it would trigger an immediate response from the Thai military. A 25-degree turn would take the plane into the Thai zone. But a 38-degree turn will keep it out of it. This was a deliberate maneuver. All these signs clearly indicate that someone was still in command of the plane when it disappeared from radar. And this led investigators to consider another chilling possibility. Could this have been a hijacking? The deliberate maneuvers, the sharp turns, the disappearance from radar, the calculated avoidance of other planes, it all started to point in that direction. This area near Iguri, where the plane disappeared, is unique. I had earlier mentioned that this waypoint is under Malaysian control, but that's not entirely accurate. Here's how the zones are divided up in this region. Here's Iguri, here's the boundary for the Malaysian zone, and here's the boundary for Vietnam. And this area here belongs to Singapore. To avoid pilots needing to talk to 3 different ATCs in quick succession, Singapore had recently delegated this zone to Malaysia. Although it belonged to Singapore, it was controlled by Malaysia. But since this delegation happened recently, Malaysian ATC, out of habit, continued to release the planes around here, and Vietnam would welcome the plane over here. Iguri was truly a no man's land, and no one was looking out for the planes here. If you wanted to hijack a plane, this was the perfect place to do it. It has been over 5 days since the plane vanished, and hopes of finding any survivors are fading fast. The search area is so vast that calling it a needle in a haystack doesn't do it justice. It is far more daunting. The plane's black boxes have locator beacons in them, but these beacons only last for 30 days. And with each passing day, the chance of locating them grows slimmer. The search team is desperate for a break, a clue, anything. And then they get a clue from an unexpected source. Let's rewind to the early hours of March 8th at Kuala Lumpur Airport. The flight crew of MH370 is busy with pre-flight checks. And as they fire up the plane's engines, something important happens. The plane's satellite data unit sends a log-on message to a communications satellite operated by a company called Inmarsat. But around the time the plane vanished from air traffic control radar, this connection was abruptly cut off, and it left the satellite unable to contact the plane. And then, at 2:25 am, nearly an hour after the disappearance, and when the plane was approximately at this location, something curious happened. The plane sent another log-on message to the satellite. It was as if the satellite data unit had rebooted and was trying to reconnect to the network. When Inmarsat engineers dug deeper into the data, they found hourly heartbeat signals from the plane for 6 hours. By measuring the time it took for the heartbeat signal to reach the satellite, engineers could estimate how far away from the satellite the plane was. The plane had sent a signal to the satellite 7 times, and so they were able to draw 7 circles. The plane was somewhere on each of these circles when it contacted the satellite. Using the last known position, the fuel load and the cruising speed, and the signal's frequency, and by comparing this with reference data from other planes in the sky at the same time, they were able to create possible flight paths as the plane crossed each arc. The final 7th arc is deep in the Indian Ocean, and there are no more heartbeats after this point. This revelation meant that for the second time, search teams had been looking for the plane in the wrong place. The Malaysian government moved the search to the southern Indian Ocean. Since this area is under Australian control, Australia leads the search efforts. This will soon turn out to be the largest and most expensive search in aviation history. They start looking here, a part of the ocean running 700 miles along the 7th arc. The plane could lie 140 miles on either side, depending on whether the plane plummeted to the ocean or if it just glided down into the ocean gradually. The 7th arc is in a remote location not frequented by ships and by traffic. It took 2 whole days for Australian search teams to reach there. 2 powerful storms had swept through the area since MH370 had disappeared, making the job of spotting debris even harder. Surface debris is normally the first step in finding a missing plane, but it is not a guarantee. Before MH370, the largest and most expensive search in aviation history takes place here, 8,000 miles away in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a search for the wreck of Air France Flight 447. Air France 447 was on its way to Paris from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. On its way, whilst over the Atlantic Ocean, it encountered severe thunderstorms. Around 4 hours into the flight, the plane's onboard computers sent a burst of emergency warnings. Then, it just goes silent. A search begins. This search team has a known flight path, an accurate final location, and they also spot surface debris within 5 days. And yet, despite all of this, it takes 2 years, 4 expeditions, and $40 million to find the plane. That is how hard finding a plane in the ocean is. MH370 has an unknown path, unknown final location, and no debris. That's how difficult finding MH370 is going to be. In the southern Indian Ocean, investigators continue looking for surface debris for 2 weeks. Even with the aid of satellites, they find nothing. And very soon, a month passes, and the locator beacons on the black boxes would have gone silent. But then, there's new hope. Australia runs a network of underwater microphones called hydrophones to detect earthquakes and wildlife. And this network has picked up an unusual noise at around the same time MH370 is estimated to have impacted the ocean. Unfortunately, with these microphones, you can't tell which direction the sound has come from. Fortunately, there are other people who have microphones in the ocean too. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization is listening for illegal nuclear tests in the ocean. The CTBT organization have a network of hydrophones set 2 kilometers apart near Perth in Western Australia. And this network can determine the direction of a sound to within half a degree. And they can also calculate the distance from the sound easily. And amazingly, the network has also heard the same sound that the earthquake microphones picked up. But when the scientists crunch the numbers, the source of the sound is far northwest than where the data from the Inmarsat satellites predicted to be. And so, it is considered not worth further investigation. The origin of the sound might have just been an underwater tremor. 2 years later, in 2016, debris of parts of a plane washed ashore on Reunion Island and all over the eastern shore of Africa. Serial numbers on the debris conclusively show that these are from MH370. Ocean drift modeling matches the estimated crash location of the plane. But still, no final wreckage. To find the wreckage, we'll need to understand why this was done. The leading theory is that the plane has been hijacked. But the question is, who did it and why? Among the passengers of flight MH370 were 2 Iranian men who had managed to board the plane using fake Austrian passports. This discovery led to Interpol investigating the backgrounds of the 2 passengers. But they quickly uncovered that these men were asylum seekers intending to find a new home in Germany. No other passengers or cabin crew raised any other red flags. And this turned the attention to the 2 pilots of MH370. First, there is 26-year-old Fariq Abdul Hamid, the first officer. He was transitioning from flying an Airbus A330 to becoming a Boeing 777 pilot. And MH370 was his final training flight. A thorough background check on him didn't reveal anything unusual. He was simply a young pilot eager to build his career in aviation. But the same can't be said about Captain Zahari. Captain Zahari Ahmed Shah, the pilot in command, was 52 years old with over 22 years of flying experience. He was also a type rating instructor, and on this flight, he was supervising Fariq's training. When investigators searched Zahari's home, they found a flight simulator.
YouTube video that I made.
Among the hundreds of saved flights, one stood out. When they loaded this particular flight back into the simulator, this is what they saw. Does this look familiar? The route displayed was eerily similar to the path MH370 is presumed to have taken. What's interesting is that this simulation was done on the 2nd of February. The simulated flight was between Kuala Lumpur and Jeddah, and he had loaded 68,500 kilos of fuel. 2 days later, on February 4th, Captain Zahari flew MH150 from Kuala Lumpur to Jeddah with the exact same amount of fuel, 68,500 kilos. Was MH150 the original target for a possible hijacking? But MH150 wasn't hijacked, and one possible reason is that due to the long distance to Jeddah, MH150 had 2 sets of flight crews on board, which could have made a diversion or a hijacking more complicated. What Zahari might have needed was a young co-pilot who wouldn't question his actions. MH370 fit that bill perfectly, with Fariq being a junior officer under Zahari's supervision. Captain Zahari was also politically minded. He's a strong supporter and distant relative of opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim. In what many believe was a politically motivated trial, on the 7th of March, Ibrahim was sentenced to 5 years in jail. It's rumored that Zahari was in court in Kuala Lumpur for the verdict, just hours before he piloted MH370, leading to claims that he took the plane down in political protest. While these pieces seem to fit together well, I need to emphasize that any claim that Zahari was a hijacker is purely speculative. There's no solid evidence, only circumstantial clues. So, if the plane was hijacked, how was it done? Let's rejoin the plane back in the air just at this point as the crew bids farewell to Malaysian ATC.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.99. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
If Captain Zahari was the person in control, he needed to make sure that he was alone in the cockpit to carry out his plans. Given First Officer Hamid was under supervision, Zahari fabricated a harmless excuse, perhaps asking for a coffee or sending a message to the cabin crew in the back. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that, in this crucial moment, he got the first officer to leave the cockpit. Once the first officer vacated the cockpit, the captain locked the door. Alone now, he was free to carry out the next part of his plan. Almost exactly a year later, Germanwings 9525 would tragically mirror this scenario. In that case, it was the co-pilot who took sole control of the plane after the captain went to the toilet. In both cases, a lone pilot sealed within the cockpit held the fate of everyone on board in their hands. But after the Germanwings disaster, a new rule was enforced. There always had to be 2 people in the cockpit. If one pilot had to leave, a cabin crew would need to take their place in the cockpit. If this safeguard had existed on MH370, the plan would have hit a dead end right then and there. The plane is being actively monitored by 2 other groups. The first is ATC, who's monitoring the plane via secondary radar. And the second is Malaysia Airlines itself, who's tracking the plane via satellite. To hide from ATC, we've already discussed why Iguri is the best possible place. It's in the middle of no man's land. So once the plane reached Iguri, the hijacker turned the transponder knob from S mode to the standby mode. And once this knob was turned, the plane immediately disappeared from radar screens in Vietnam, Malaysia, and in Thailand. Next, he had to hide the plane from Malaysia Airlines. Remember how when the plane's engines first powered up, the SATCOM unit sent a log-on message to the satellite network? If the person in control turns off the SATCOM unit on the plane would end up sending a log-off message to the network. And this would raise alarms within Malaysia Airlines. In order for Malaysia Airlines to not be suspicious, he needed to make this look like the SATCOM unit had failed. To pull this off, he switched off the 2 main power generators, the 2 backup generators, and the APU. This loss of power turned off the SATCOM unit instantly without it sending any messages to Malaysia Airlines. MH370 is now truly invisible. With power gone, the emergency ram turbine dropped to provide power for basic functions. And because of this, the plane had to be flown the old school way, manually. And this explains why we saw minor deviations in the flight path when it was flying over the Malay Peninsula. There's also speculation that he might have depressurized the cabin, although there's no way to confirm this. The plane is now approaching Penang. Penang is Zahari's hometown. But here at Penang, there was a new challenge. The Indonesian air defense zone lay directly ahead. Much like the Thai air defense zone that he had skillfully navigated earlier, he had to avoid this area to prevent triggering a response from Indonesian defense forces. So, as he had already practiced, he banked the plane right to a heading of 310 degrees, setting a course towards the waypoint Mekar. As the plane banked right, a cell tower at Penang registered a brief ping, and this ping only lasted for a few seconds. The ping was later traced to an iPhone registered to the first officer, and then, just as abruptly as it appeared, it disappeared. After making a right turn at Penang and heading towards Mekar, the plane began following the flight corridor known as November 571. This was a strategic move because by sticking to an established flight path, the plane wouldn't raise any red flags on military radar. It would blend in with other commercial flights in the area. Around 2:03 am, Malaysia Airlines attempted to send a message instructing the pilots to contact Vietnam ATC. But there was no response. With the plane's SATCOM turned off, the message never reached the cockpit. It is now 2:22 am, and the plane is approaching the waypoint Mekar. Although the person in control intended to fly directly to Mekar, because they were flying manually with minimal instruments, they had drifted slightly south. And this was the last point where the plane was monitored by Malaysian military radar. The next waypoint, Neelam, is critical, and any mistake here could unravel the entire plan. This area is surrounded by potential threats. The Indian air defense zone is straight ahead of them. Indonesian and Thai air defenses are to the south and to their east. Crossing into any of these zones could trigger a military response. The escape route was to make a left turn at Neelam onto the Papa 627 airway, leading to the waypoint Powys. This airway is heavily trafficked by flights heading towards Australia, allowing the plane to blend in with other commercial traffic. But the turn at Neelam is tight, and it needs to be precise. And almost as if he knew what the exact range of Malaysia's military radar is, just 3 minutes after the final radar contact by Malaysian military, the person in control switched the power generators back on in order to be able to use the autopilot. This move, though, also reactivated the SATCOM module. Just like it did when the plane first powered up in Kuala Lumpur, the SATCOM module sent a log-on message to the Inmarsat satellite. This was the first ping Inmarsat received at 2:25 am, helping to establish the first arc. With autopilot engaged, he directed the plane to fly to Neelam. However, the person in control believed that they were still on course to Mekar and hadn't realized that the plane had drifted south. The autopilot begins turning the plane right towards Neelam, and it is only then does he realize that he was off course. To correct this, he made what is now known as the final major turn and steered the plane left towards Powys. As the plane reached Powys, it likely began the second phase of the final major turn. It veered left towards the south. Several studies have suggested that the new heading was set to 188 degrees. This track would not only help avoid the storm clouds that were in the area, but also help him steer clear of detection by military radars along Sumatra's west coast. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation at the Malaysian Airlines Operations Center was becoming increasingly tense. They had lost all contact with the plane and they were desperately trying to re-establish communication. At 2:40 am, they made a final attempt to reach the flight via SATCOM. The call connected, but the cockpit remained eerily silent. After that unanswered call, the plane continued its ominous journey southward, making hourly handshakes with the satellite, tracing a path that crossed the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth arcs. After 7.5 hours in the air, the plane runs out of fuel. Boeing engineers simulate what happens when the 777 runs out of fuel, and they recreate the likely final minutes of the airplane. First, the right engine flames out. The autopilot compensates for the imbalance with a hard left turn. Minutes after that, the left engine flames out too. With no power, the autopilot and the SATCOM unit switch off. The APU is then switched on to provide emergency power. This causes the SATCOM unit to reboot and send a final log-on message to the satellite. This corresponds to the 7th arc. Depending on whether there was someone at the controls of the plane or not, the plane would have either plummeted straight down into the ocean or glided gradually, impacting the southern Indian Ocean at a shallow angle. In every Boeing simulation, the crash site lies within 29 miles of the 7th arc. But even after years of search in that location, both governmental and private search parties have been unable to locate the crash site of MH370, making this the longest unsolved mystery in aviation history.